Bryn's face didn't just turn pale. It shattered the second she realized I, Juno, now hold her entire future in my hands. 3 months ago, I was a ghost they tried to erase to soothe her broken heart. Now, I'm the boss she has to beg for mercy. But the fire that burned their world down didn't start in this boardroom. It started in a place that looked like a dream, but felt like a cold, chrome-plated tomb. Long before the suits and the power, there was only the suffocating, immaculate silence of a house that loved a lie more than its own daughter. The kitchen of our suburban Chicago home was immaculate, a cold shrine of white marble and polished chrome that always felt more like a showroom than a place where memories were made. I stood by the island, my fingers trembling slightly as I smoothed the frosting on a small vanilla cake. It wasn't much, just a simple round layer I'd bought with the tips I'd surreptitiously saved from my shifts at the grocery store. Hung it represented 18 years of quiet endurance. I was wearing a dress I had spent 4 months sewing in the dead of night, a soft navy silk that felt like a secret armor against the skin. I glanced at the digital clock on the oven. 11 minutes until midnight. 11 minutes until I was legally an adult. A milestone I had imagined would finally grant me a seat at the table of this family. But the house was eerily silent, save for the distant, rhythmic sobbing echoing from the living room. It was a sound I knew well, the sound of Bryn's latest catastrophe, a performance that always managed to suck the oxygen out of every room. The swinging door creaked open, and my mother, Vera, stepped in. She didn't look at the cake. She didn't look at my dress. Her eyes were hard, fixed on the dimmer switch on the wall. Without a word, she slid it down until the kitchen was bathed in a suffocating twilight. "Turn that off, Juno," she commanded, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the air. Bryn is spiraling. Her heart is in pieces after the breakup, and she cannot bear to see a celebration she isn't part of. It's insensitive of you to be standing here with this. I stared at the shadowed silhouette of my cake. "It's my 18th birthday, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I realized then that love in this house was a finite resource, a bowl of water that was always poured into Bryn's leaking cup, leaving me to survive on the damp remains. True maturity isn't about reaching a number. It's about realizing that some people will never be capable of loving you the way you need. The tension in the room thickened as Bryn herself drifted in, a silk robe fluttering behind her like a pale ghost. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of practiced misery. "I can smell the vanilla," she choked out, leaning against the doorframe as if the scent itself were a physical blow. "How can you think of sugar when my entire life has just collapsed? You're so selfish, Juno. You always have been." Vera immediately moved to her side, wrapping an arm around Bryn's shoulders, adopting my sister's manufactured victimhood as her own holy crusade. What happened next felt like a scene from a movie where the sound suddenly cuts out. Vera reached across the counter and picked up my cake. I thought she was going to put it in the fridge, perhaps hide it away for a better time that would never come. Instead, she walked with a terrifying, purposeful stride toward the back door. She slid it open, the freezing Chicago wind whipping into the warm kitchen, and with a casual flick of her wrist, she emptied the plate into the dog's bowl on the porch. "Barnaby needs a distraction from all this crying more than you need the vanity of a party," she said, her back to me. I watched the dog eagerly tear into the soft sponge, swallowing my 18 years in 3 greedy bites. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood there in my navy silk dress, feeling the frost of the night air settle into my bones. I realized she didn't do it just to be cruel. She did it because she needed me to stay small so Bryn could feel big. It was an essential trade-off in her mind. Have you ever trusted someone you shouldn't have? I know many of you have felt that hollow ache when you realize you are a secondary character in your own home. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were already darting back to Bryn, checking for approval. "I hope this makes the house quiet for you, Mom," I said softly, my voice devoid of the anger she expected. "I wouldn't want my existence to be the thing that breaks your peace." It was a statement of a boundary, a quiet declaration that I was no longer a participant in their theater. I saw a flicker of confusion in Vera's eyes, a brief moment where she realized she hadn't broken me, but had instead accidentally set me free. I turned and walked toward the hallway, passing my father, Arthur. He was standing in the shadows by the coat rack, hiding behind a folded copy of the Chicago Tribune. He didn't look up, his passivity acting as a silent seal of approval on the scene he had just witnessed. "Sorry, kid," he muttered, the words landing like a lead weight. It was a weak, hollow apology that felt more insulting than the act itself. In that moment, I understood that his silence wasn't peace. It was a betrayal. That's where it all started. I retreated to my room, locking the door with a soft click that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench. I didn't pack a suitcase full of clothes. I packed a life of preparation. I reached under my loose floorboard and pulled out the laptop I had spent a year rebuilding from discarded parts and the legal documents I had quietly gathered. I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. The navy silk was beautiful, but it was the girl inside it who had finally caught fire. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. The Chicago snow began to swirl against my window, a white veil descending over the suburbs. I changed into heavy boots and a dark coat, my movements deliberate and rhythmic. I didn't feel the cold, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't panicking. I felt like I was finally becoming real, stepping out of the sketch my mother had drawn for me, and into a portrait of my own making. I took one last look at the room, the painted-over height marks on the doorframe, the empty shelves, and I realized I wasn't leaving home. I was going to find it. I stood at the front door, the heavy oak handle cold in my palm. Behind me, the house was silent again, the darkness having finally swallowed the last of the birthday light. I didn't leave a note because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of an explanation they wouldn't listen to anyway. I stepped out into the white abyss, the snow erasing my footprints as fast as I could make them. The wind howled like a ghost as I boarded the bus, leaving the girl I was behind in the snow. My breath hitched, the recycled air of the cabin smelling of damp wool and old coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile, frozen silence of the home I had just abandoned. I found a seat in the back, pulling my laptop bag closer to my chest. My hands were still numb, not just from the Chicago cold, but from the icy realization that my life had been dismantled while I was still living it. I needed to see it for myself. I needed the numbers to tell me the truth that my mother's eyes never could. I opened the laptop, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the frosted window. My fingers hovered over the keys, a familiar dance of muscle memory as I logged into the college savings portal my grandmother had established for me years ago. I expected a modest balance, enough for a deposit and a few months of books. Instead, the screen flickered to life, displaying a hollow, mocking zero. The grandmother's trust, the one intended to be my ticket out of the shadows, was gone. It hadn't just vanished. It had been surgically extracted. I navigated through the transaction history, my eyes stinging as I followed the paper trail. Vera had used her joint custodial access, a legal loophole she exploited just days before my 18th birthday, to transfer the entire fund into a private account labeled Social Debut. It was Bryn's fund. My future had been siphoned off to pay for club memberships, designer gowns, and the expensive healing trips Bryn used to mask her vanity. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, but trust is a currency you must earn. Today, my mother's credit had run out. Have you ever stood in the wreckage of a promise and wondered how the person who gave it could sleep so soundly? I sat there, the bus rattling over the uneven asphalt of Lakeshore Drive, and I felt the last chord of my hesitation snap. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for my phone to hurl accusations at the dark house I'd left behind. A house built on theft cannot stand, and I realized I was no longer interested in trying to shore up the foundation. I remembered a small locket Bryn had dropped on the hallway floor earlier that night. I had picked it up, intending to keep it as a petty souvenir of her greed. But I stopped. I had placed it neatly on her vanity with a note. "You don't need to steal to be enough, Bryn. I hope you find what you're looking for." Even in the middle of a betrayal, I refused to become the monster they wanted me to be. My focus shifted. If I left now without leverage, Vera would use the law to hunt me down, labeling me a disturbed runaway to protect her image. I needed an insurance policy. My fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the family's shared cloud with the administrative passwords I'd memorized months ago. I wasn't looking for family photos or sentimental memories. I was searching for the black box, the hidden digital ledger of Vera's offshore spending and the fraudulent tax filings my father, Arthur, had been quietly tucking away to keep the family's failing lifestyle afloat. The download bar crawled across the screen, a digital countdown to my safety. I watched the files populate. Offshore_transfers_2024. Internal_audit_notes. Tax_exempt_discrepancies. It was a map of their moral decay. Power isn't about hurting others, it's about making sure no one can ever hurt you again. I wasn't taking their secrets to destroy them. I was taking them to ensure they stayed far away from me. I copied everything onto a military-grade encrypted drive, the cold metal casing feeling like an anchor in a storm. This was my mutual assured destruction treaty. Looking back now, I see that moment as my true graduation. I wasn't just a girl fleeing a bad home. I was a strategic architect of my own survival. I stared at the Chicago skyline, the towers of steel and light appearing like distant islands in the white abyss of the blizzard. I didn't realize it then, but the girl named Juno was already dead, replaced by someone who understood that silence is only a weakness if you don't know how to use it. I checked the time, 3:12 a.m. The world was asleep, unaware that one small ghost was rewriting the rules of her existence. As the bus slowed near the transit hub, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification from my bank popped up, a digital slap across the face. My last $20, the tiny emergency fund I'd kept in a separate account, had just been withdrawn. Vera had activated an overdraft protection link, siphoning the last bit of my physical reality to cover an unpaid florist bill for Bryn's healing ceremony. I stared at the screen, the balance reflecting my status in their world. $0. I was now truly at zero. A wave of terror washed over me, a primitive fear of the void, but it was quickly replaced by an exhilarating, crystalline freedom. They had taken everything, my cake, my trust, my savings, and now my last few dollars. They had finally run out of things to steal. I stood up, slinging my backpack over my shoulder, feeling the weight of the encrypted drive against my hip. I stepped off the bus and into the biting wind, my boots crunching on the fresh snow. The cold air was the first thing that had felt honest in 18 years. I stood at the deserted bus stop, my hands trembling as I gazed at the dark horizon. I didn't know where I would sleep or what I would eat tomorrow. But as I watched the taillights of the buses disappear into the white mist, I felt a strange sense of peace. My mother thought she had won by abandoning me empty-handed. When you have nothing left to lose, you have the right to do anything. I took a deep breath. The air was bone-chilling, and then I began to walk. My boots clicked rhythmically against the salt-stained pavement of the financial district, a stark contrast to the soft, heavy silence of the snow-covered suburbs I had fled. The city didn't sleep. It vibrated with a cold, electric energy that matched the hum in my own chest. 3 months had passed since I walked out into the white abyss. In that time, I had learned that the world doesn't care about your tears, but it respects your utility. I had secured a position as a night shift data entry clerk at Stark Global, a titan of Chicago industry, using a resume that was technically a masterpiece of strategic omission. To the HR department, I was just Juno, a high school graduate looking for graveyard hours. To myself, I was a ghost rebuilding a skeleton. The contrast between my reality and my surroundings was almost cinematic. By day, I lived in a tiny studio apartment where the heater clanked like a dying engine and the scent of damp wool never quite left the air. By night, I ascended into the glass and steel perfection of the Stark Global skyscraper. Looking back now, I should have seen the irony. My parents thought they were depriving me of a home by erasing my presence, but they accidentally gave me the world. You can't cage someone who has learned to find comfort in the storm. Every night, as the elevators hummed upward, I felt the Juno they tried to keep small expanding into something sovereign. The graveyard shift was my sanctuary. While the rest of the city dreamt, I sat in the dim glow of triple monitors, processing the digital refuse of a global empire. But I didn't just enter data. I studied it. I spent my breaks digging into public filings and tracing the logic of the company's algorithmic trading models. I wasn't looking for a promotion. I was looking for the truth. It was during one of these deep dives that I found it, a microscopic, recurring decay in the latest predictive model. a digital rot that was quietly siphoning millions in slippage every single hour. It was a hole in the hull of a ship everyone thought was unsinkable. It was 2:48 a.m. when the atmosphere in the building shifted. The quiet hum of the night shift was shattered by the frantic chime of emergency alerts. From my station, I could see the executive floor above lit up like a lighthouse. Silas, the CEO, a man whose face was usually only seen on magazine covers and internal memos, was pacing the boardroom. I watched through the glass partitions as a dozen MIT-educated vice presidents scrambled, their faces ashen in the blue light of the monitors. They were bleeding money, and they couldn't find the wound. I stood up, my encrypted drive, the one containing my family's black box, heavy in my pocket. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a tray of emergency coffee and a stack of the data logs I'd been quietly printing all week. The security guards at the executive elevator didn't even look at me. To them, I was just part of the furniture. When I stepped into the boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and desperation. Silas was shouting over a speakerphone at a team in London. "It's not a glitch. We're losing 40,000 a second. Find the leak!" I didn't wait for permission. I walked straight to the massive digital glass board where their primary algorithm was projected. The VPs stared at me in stunned silence as I took a digital stylus and circled a single, innocuous line of corrupted code nestled deep in the sublayer. "You're looking for a thief," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But you've actually got an infection. Your rounding error in the Tokyo trades isn't a mistake. It's an architectural feedback loop." The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. Silas turned, his sharp, predatory eyes locking onto mine. "Who are you?" I didn't blink. I explained the logic with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I showed them how the decay I'd found weeks ago had finally reached a critical mass. Within 10 minutes, the bleeding stopped. The monitors flashed from red back to a steady, rhythmic green. The room exhaled, but I remained still. I wasn't there to be a hero. I was there to be a partner. If you cannot see the hole in your own house, it doesn't matter how expensive the furniture is. Silas dismissed his executives with a wave of his hand, leaving just the two of us in the vast, silent room. He slumped into his leather chair, looking at me with a mixture of exhaustion and profound curiosity. "That clerk uniform doesn't fit you," he remarked, his voice raspy. "How much do you want? 100,000? A permanent contract? Name your price for saving my skin." This was the moment of the sovereign bargain. I knew that if I took the money, I would always be his debtor. If I took the job, I would always be his servant. I looked him in the eye and said, "I don't want a reward for cleaning your floor. I want the keys to the building." I leaned over the mahogany table, my reflection sharp in the polished wood. "I want a seat in the strategy department, direct reporting to you, and 48 hours to rebuild the architecture of that model so it never happens again. If I save this company's future, I don't work for you, Silas. I partner with you." He laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any mirth. He recognized the killer instinct in my eyes, the same one he had used to build his empire from the dirt. He realized I wasn't a victim of circumstance, but a predator of destiny. "You're 18, he noted, glancing at my file. "Why are you this hungry?" "Because I know what it's like to have everything stolen by people who claim to love me," I replied. "Money is a tool, but power is a shield. I'm tired of being vulnerable." He reached into his desk and pulled out a black executive keycard, sliding it across the table like a challenge. "Prove it," he said. As I took the card, the weight of it felt like a scepter. I thought of Vera and Arthur back in the suburbs, probably still arguing over who got the larger half of a leftover sandwich. I felt a sudden, sharp pity for them. They were still fighting over a small cake, while I was now playing for the entire bakery. I didn't realize it then, but that was the second I stopped being a daughter. I walked out of the boardroom and toward my new office, the sun just beginning to bleed over the Chicago horizon. I sat down at my new terminal and swiped my executive card. The internal HR portal flickered to life, showing the day's priority notifications. My heart stopped. There, at the top of the junior social PR applicant pool, was a familiar name: Bryn. She had listed a series of fabricated credentials, claiming a deep background in high-level networking. I stared at my sister's name on the screen, her resume a pile of lies, and I realized the game had only just begun. She was looking for a way in, unaware that the door she was knocking on was already being locked from the inside. Looking back now, I see that the universe has a wicked sense of timing. I leaned back in my chair, the Chicago skyline turning gold, and for the first time in my life, I smiled. I know many of you have felt the urge to strike back when you've been wronged, but the best response isn't a scream, it's a transformation. I wasn't forgotten. I was just waiting for the right light to show them who I really was. The hum of the city lights below my office at Stark Global felt like a distant heartbeat, one I had finally synchronized with. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching Chicago pulse in shades of amber and electric blue. I wasn't the girl in the navy silk dress anymore. I was Juno, a name that now carried weight in these halls. But as I turned back to my desk, my personal phone vibrated with a persistence that felt like a warning. I stared at the screen. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The voice that met me was a jagged glass shards of the woman I used to call Mom. Vera was weeping, a sound so fragile it felt engineered. "Juno, please don't hang up," she choked out, her breath hitching in a way that signaled a rehearsed tragedy. She told me she had stage 4 cancer. She said the doctors gave her months. She begged me to come home just once to sign medical power of attorney papers so I could manage her final care. I listened with a clinical detachment that surprised even me. My internal radar was screaming. The timing was too surgical. Silas was preparing to announce my promotion to the board tomorrow. Desperation is the loudest mask for deceit. A mother who truly loves her child doesn't use her own death as a bargaining chip to lure them back into a cage. I offered her a calm, steady empathy, my voice devoid of the grief she was fishing for. "I'm sorry to hear you're suffering, Vera," I said. "Send the documents over. I'll look them over before I commit to anything." I refused to let the hook sink in. That's where it all started. Within an hour, the medical documents arrived in my inbox. I didn't open them with a heavy heart. I opened them with a forensic eye. I leveraged my new corporate resources, forwarding the files to the legal team at Stark Global. I watched the clock, the silence of my office growing heavy. When the head of our legal department called me back 10 minutes later, his voice was tight with professional disgust. "Juno, these aren't care authorizations. They're assumption of debt contracts." The discovery was a cold splash of reality. Vera and Bryn hadn't just been living beyond their means. They had spiraled into a $500,000 pit of predatory loans. They had used Bryn's vanity as collateral and lost. The papers were designed to legally transfer every cent of that debt into my name, leveraging my clean credit and high salary position to bail them out of their own moral bankruptcy. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun. It's a person who knows exactly which part of your heart to stab to make you sign your own life away. I didn't stop there. Using my security clearance, I cross-referenced the Chicago hospital records Vera had mentioned. I found nothing. No diagnosis, no admission, no stage 4 anything. She had never even been a patient. The illness was a total fabrication, a ghost story told to a daughter they had already erased. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a profound sense of moral clarity. I realized it then. I didn't owe them my future just because they had given me a past I never asked for. Silas walked into my office a moment later, his expression grim. He had seen the legal report. "Do you want me to handle this, Juno?" he asked, his hand resting on the back of my chair. "I can make this go away with one phone call." For a second, I was tempted. I wanted to let his power crush them. But then I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I politely declined. To forgive a debt is one thing, but to allow someone to steal your future under the guise of love is a sin against oneself. I needed to be the one to draw the line. I sent a brief professional reply to Vera. I didn't use the word mom. I wrote, "I've reviewed the medical papers. Since they are financial in nature, I've forwarded them to the legal team at Stark Global. I hope your recovery is as swift as your imagination." I hit send, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I stood by the window, the Chicago lights reflecting in my eyes like a shield. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was an architect of my own justice. I didn't realize it then, but the web was much larger than a few unpaid loans. As I prepared to leave, Silas handed me a confidential folder he'd pulled from his private investigators. "It's worse than you thought, Juno," he said softly. "They didn't just spend the money. They committed a felony to get it. Bryn's breakup wasn't about a broken heart. It was about a failed extortion attempt against her ex's family." My knuckles whitened around the folder. The scent of their desperation seemed to leak through the paper. I closed the file, the cold weight of the evidence in my hands. I knew that going home was no longer an option. Not for the holidays. And certainly not for a funeral that never happened. I regarded that moment as the final death of my guilt. I realized the person I was trying to save was the one burning down my house. I stood in the middle of the office, a solitary entity, and I realized that silence was no longer my refuge. It was my weapon. I adjusted my suit jacket, looked at my reflection in the dark glass, and realized that for the first time, I wasn't the one being hunted. The Chicago rain lashed against the windows of Stark Global, a rhythmic, percussive sound that felt like a countdown. I had spent 18 years as the shadow in my mother's house, but in this high-tech intelligence suite, surrounded by the hum of servers and the cool blue glow of advanced analytics, I was the light. I had moved beyond survival. I was now performing a digital autopsy on the people who had tried to bury me. Using my newly granted administrative privileges, I began to peel back the layers of the legal threats surrounding Bryn. I realized quickly that the Stage 4 cancer ruse was just a clumsy smokescreen, a desperate distraction designed to cover a much darker reality. As I navigated through subpoena logs and non-disclosure agreements, the truth began to materialize. It wasn't a tragic breakup that had sent my sister into a spiral. It was a cease and desist order from her wealthy ex-boyfriend's high-powered legal team. I found the police reports tucked away in a private server. Bryn hadn't just been dumped. She had been caught red-handed in a failed criminal extortion attempt. She had faked a pregnancy, forged medical documents, and attempted to leverage a 7-figure hush money settlement out of a family that had far more resources than her imagination could handle. I stared at my sister's digital footprint and felt a profound, hollow sense of mourning for the person she could have been. Lies are like salt water. The more you drink them to survive, the thirstier you become until you drown yourself and everyone on your ship. The air in the suite felt thick with the scent of ozone and old secrets. I scrolled through encrypted messages between Bryn and Vera, my stomach turning with every line. Vera hadn't just been a passive enabler. She was the architect. She had coached Bryn on the extortion, providing the emotional coaching to make the scam believable. Now, the ex-boyfriend's family was preparing a massive counter-lawsuit for wire fraud and defamation. My family wasn't just broke. They were legally radioactive. Looking back now, I should have seen that their need for me wasn't about love. It was about laundering their reputation through my clean record. Silas entered the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He stood behind me, looking at the data I had unraveled. "They wanted to use you as a fall girl, Juno," he said, his voice a low rumble of moral disgust. "They needed your corporate status at Stark Global to act as a shield for their litigation. If you had signed those papers Vera sent, you wouldn't have been a daughter. You would have been a human shield." I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment my last lingering thread of guilt finally snapped. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, feeling the weight of the revelation. Character is destiny. I am not destroying them. I am simply stepping out of the way so they can meet the consequences they spent years building. I decided right then to let the legal process take its course without my interference. Have you ever realized that the person you were trying to save was the one holding the matches to your house? I know many of you have struggled with the duty of family, but true duty begins with protecting your own integrity. I spent the next hour preparing a formal legal firewall, a set of documents that completely severed my financial and legal liability from my parents and sister. I worked with a clinical, icy precision, ensuring their crimes could never touch Stark Global or my own assets. I wasn't acting out of revenge, I was acting out of self-preservation. I shared a quiet moment with Silas as I finalized the filing. It's a heavy thing to realize that the people who gave you life are the ones trying to take it away, I whispered. But I will not hate them. Hate is a heavy coat that I refuse to wear in this winter. Silas nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep respect for my restraint. Wisdom is knowing when to let the storm pass, he replied. And you, Juno, have become the eye of the storm. I hit the final execute button on the filing, effectively orphaning myself from their chaos. To further protect my future, I sent an anonymous tip to the ex-boyfriend's legal team regarding the debt transfer attempt Vera had made. I wasn't being cruel. I was closing the trap they had set for me. The rain continued to pound the glass, a chaotic symphony that matched the internal shift I was feeling. I was no longer a victim of their narrative. I was the author of my own. I thought about the girl who had watched her birthday cake be fed to a dog, and I wanted to tell her that the hunger she felt that night would be the very thing that fed her success. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I was no longer afraid of the skeletons in their closet. I had opened the door and let in the light. My assistant, a young man who always looked slightly intimidated by the silence of the intelligence suite, entered with an urgent update. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Ma'am, there are 2 women at the front desk," he stammered, checking his tablet. "They are demanding to see the head of strategy for their scheduled job interview. They claim to be family, and they're making a significant scene. They say you owe them this meeting." I felt a cold, sharp thrill run through me. They had finally come. They had followed the scent of my success like sharks following blood in the water, unaware that they were swimming directly into a cage. I stood up, smoothing the lapels of my designer suit, the fabric feeling like a suit of armor. I looked at Silas, who gave me a faint, encouraging smile. "Let them in," I said, my voice as steady as the Chicago skyline. "I've been waiting 18 years for this interview." I walked toward the executive elevators, my heels clicking a steady, powerful rhythm against the marble. I wasn't the child they had erased. I was the power they couldn't ignore. Looking back now, I realized that some confrontations are necessary not for revenge, but for closure. I was about to show them that the girl they treated as an accident was now the person who controlled their fate. The game was over, and they were the only ones who didn't know it yet. I stepped out into the lobby, where the sunlight of high noon poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the marble floor with a blinding, unforgiving brilliance. I saw them immediately. Vera and Bryn were sitting in the waiting area, draped in designer fabrics that I knew were bought with the siphoned remains of my future. Bryn spotted me first. She didn't recognize my silhouette against the light, only my simple, tailored charcoal suit. She stood up, her face twisted in that familiar, condescending sneer. She marched over and thrust a lukewarm paper cup into my hand. "Look at you. Still playing servant," she laughed, not even looking me in the eye as she pulled out a lipstick. "I'm here for a director role, so you'd better get used to calling me ma'am again. Go get me a fresh one, and make it quick." I looked down at the cup, then back at her. I didn't pull away. I didn't snap. I felt a profound sense of irony as I held the beverage she thought I was destined to serve. Arrogance is the loudest before the fall. They were still living in a world that no longer exists, clutching a crown that had already melted. Vera joined her, standing tall with a haughty expression. "Stay out of our way today, Juno," she hissed, her voice a low threat. "I'll have no problem telling your HR department exactly how you ran away like a thief in the night. Don't ruin this for your sister." I smiled, a slow, quiet thing that didn't reach my eyes. I didn't realize it then, but their blindness was my greatest advantage. "The interview is ready for you," I said softly, handing the cup back to Bryn. "I hope you're prepared to discuss your contributions." I walked past them toward the boardroom, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing like a countdown. Looking back now, I see that the most dangerous thing you can do to an AI key is to let them believe they are still in control until the very second the floor vanishes. The glass room was a masterpiece of transparency, a floating executive suite that overlooked the entire Chicago loop. Silas was already there, standing by the window, his back to the door as Vera and Bryn were ushered in. They sat down with a practiced, arrogant grace, Bryn immediately launching into a rehearsed monologue about visionary leadership and family values. She talked about her deep background in networking, oblivious to the fact that every word was a fresh lie added to the pyre. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave with such confidence? Then, Silas turned around. He didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the high-back leather chair at the head of the table. I walked in, the sunlight catching the sharp lines of my suit, and slowly rotated the chair to face them. I sat down, my hands folded neatly on the mahogany surface. The silence that followed was absolute. Vera's face turned an ashen gray, the color of wet cement, as her designer handbag slipped from her lap. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling a bottle of multivitamins, the stage 4 medication she had used to try and trap me. "Welcome to Stark Global," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I believe you're here to discuss merit. Let's start with the $500,000 in debt you tried to pin on me, and the fraudulent insurance claims you filed last Tuesday." Bryn's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air in a tank that had just been drained. Vera tried to speak, her voice a wavering, pathetic shadow of the woman who had fed my birthday cake to a dog. "Juno, honey, we were coming to find you." I didn't let her finish. I placed a thick blue folder on the desk. Not an employment contract, but a legal foreclosure notice. "Water sustains life, Mom," I said, my tone clinical and devoid of the heat she wanted. "Blood only matters if it isn't being used as a weapon. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a safety net. I am neither." I watched them realize that the real estate arm of Stark Global had recently acquired their mortgage. I wasn't just their superior in this office. I was now the owner of the roof over their heads. Real success isn't about the title on this door. It's about being able to look in the mirror without flinching. I told them this with a calm that felt like a shield. Silas stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed a live feed of the wire fraud charges being processed by the ex-boyfriend's legal team. The data I had flagged wasn't just corporate gossip. It was a criminal roadmap. The stage 4 inches lie was gone. The director fantasy was dead. All that remained were 2 women who had traded their souls for a lifestyle they could never afford. Vera began to weep, a frantic, ugly sound that lacked the grace of her previous performances. She reached across the table, her fingers clawing at the air toward me. "We're family, Juno! You can't do this to us! What will people say?" I stood up, the movement fluid and decisive. I didn't feel the need to shout. I didn't feel the need to gloat. "The world will say exactly what the evidence shows," I replied, "that you chose greed over love, and now the bill has finally come due." That's where it all ended. Security guards stepped into the room, their presence a silent professional wall. Bryn was frozen, her eyes darting between the foreclosure notice and the guards, the realization finally sinking in that her debut was actually an exit. I looked at her one last time, not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet pity. "The interview is over," I said, my voice steady. "But the audit of your choices has only just begun. Please escort them out. They no longer belong in this building or in my life." I watched them through the glass as they were led away, their shadows stretching thinly across the marble floor. Bryn stumbled, her expensive high heels clicking incessantly, while Vera walked with her head down, the weight of the final lies pressing down on her. The air in the room seemed to lighten the moment the door closed. I turned to look at the Chicago skyline, the sunlight warming my face. I was no longer angry. Finally, I felt relieved. I had regained my name, my future, and my peace. I walked into the legal briefing room where the fate of Vera and Bryn was being codified. The air smelled of old paper and clinical finality. I sat across from my legal team, reviewing the formal charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and the faked medical extortion that had finally caught up with them. The law, much like the data I managed at Stark Global, was indifferent to emotion. It only cared for the architecture of the truth. I chose not to intervene. I didn't ask for leniency, nor did I demand extra weight. I simply allowed the legal system to reflect the choices they had made. Have you ever realized that the greatest punishment for a liar isn't a scream, but a mirror they can no longer look away from? During the recess, I made one final move. Not out of obligation, but out of a quiet, sovereign compassion. I ensured that Arthur, my father, was legally untethered from Vera's financial crimes. He had been a passenger on a sinking ship, too weak to grab a life vest but too passive to be the captain of the disaster. I provided him with a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the toxic echoes of the suburban villa. It was a gesture of mercy, a way to honor the man I once hoped he would be, while maintaining a strict, unbreakable, no-contact boundary. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting people back into your life. It means letting go of the anger so it doesn't burn your own house down. I refused to meet Vera in the holding room. My lawyer asked if I wanted to hear her last statement, but I simply shook my head. I've spent 18 years listening to her lies, I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. I have no more time for her fiction. In that moment, I understood that closure isn't something they give you. It's something you take for yourself. I walked out of the courthouse, the cold air stinging my lungs, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't a prison. It was a palace. Later that evening, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple as I pulled into the driveway of the suburban mansion. It was officially mine now, purchased through a corporate real estate arm and a personal buyout. I turned the key in the lock, the sound echoing through the empty foyer. I walked through the rooms where I had once felt invisible, touching the walls as if to claim them. I removed the old portraits of the perfect family, the ones where we were all smiling while I was slowly disappearing. I packed them into a box for my father. This house was just wood and stone. It was my spirit that gave it light, and now that light belonged entirely to me. They thought they could take my home by taking my name. They didn't realize that home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you build within yourself when everyone else walks away. I stood on the back patio, the Chicago skyline a distant, glittering promise. Silas met me there, offering a silent nod of respect. No words were needed. My real family was the man who saw my worth when I was a ghost in a grocery store, not the people who shared my DNA but couldn't see my soul. I wasn't a daughter of a bloodline. I was an architect of a destiny. I walked back into the kitchen, the place where my heart first broke. 3 months had passed since I'd stepped out into the snow. I sat down at the same table where my mother had fed the dog my birthday cake. But this time, the table was set for one person, covered with a fine linen tablecloth. In the center was a beautiful cake, a vanilla cake I'd bought to celebrate the woman I had become. I began lighting the candles one by one. The orange light reflected in my eyes, casting long, brilliant shadows against the white marble. I lit 18 candles, and then I added a 19th for the year I was finally living. I didn't make a wish for wealth or fame. I made a wish for the continued strength to never let anyone else's darkness extinguish my flame. I looked into the camera of my heart, speaking to every soul who has ever felt erased. Finally, I didn't win because I was stronger than them. I won because I was more honest with myself. If you've ever rebuilt from nothing, you know that the first brick is always self-respect. I know many of you have lived through something like this. What did you do when you realized the cage was finally open? I took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling fresh and light. I blew out the candles in one steady breath, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a prayer answered. The screen of my past finally went to black, leaving only the sound of my calm, steady breathing in the quiet. I reached out and touched the wood of the table, feeling the solid reality of my own power. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I was Juno, and I was finally home. I watched the smoke from the candles drift toward the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't a prison. It was a palace. It was the sound of a story that had finally reached its true beginning. I closed my eyes and smiled, listening to the quiet hum of a life that belonged entirely to me.